Hello, I'm Graham and I hope everyone's having a great day, and welcome to part 3 in this video tutorial series for new users to the Panasonic Lumix FZ1000 camera. Now in today's video we're going to look at the second of the semi-automatic modes, which is going to be the shutter priority or the aperture priority modes. Now the choice between aperture priority and shutter priority will depend on either your need for depth of field, in which case you'll be using aperture priority, or if you want to arrest any subject motion, in that case you'll be using shutter priority. So for example, if you are a sports photographer, then obviously arresting subject motion blur is your primary need. Or if you're a landscape photographer, then you want depth of field, so you're going to be using smaller apertures. If you want both the arresting of subject motion and depth of field, then that's going to be your choice when we use manual exposure, and that we're looking at in the next video. So today we will look at both the aperture and shutter priority, how to set both of those modes up, how to apply exposure compensation, and how to get the best image quality from both those modes. So let me set the camera up so we can film the back of it and we'll start the tutorial. So we're currently in the program auto mode, indicated by the P icon on the LCD screen. First of all, we'll look at shooting in the aperture priority mode, and the aperture priority mode gives you the opportunity to set the aperture you want to give you the amount of depth of field that you want in a shot. The smaller the aperture, the more depth of field. The bigger the aperture, the less depth of field. So to engage the aperture priority mode, we turn the top mode dial so the A aligns with the white index mark on the flash housing, and again that's indicated by the fact that we get an A appearing on the LCD screen. Now, as with program auto, we could use the back control dial to affect either the aperture or the exposure value compensation. Remember, exposure value compensation is a means to correct the camera if the metering circuit under or overexposes the picture. So if your picture looks too dark, you'll add some exposure value compensation to make it lighter, or if the picture's too light, you'll take some out to make it darker. So at the moment we're shooting this landscape shot, and at the moment my aperture is f4. So with a landscape, traditionally you want a little bit more depth of field, so I want to use something like aperture of f6.3 or f7.1. If you've got the camera set up for 1 EV increment, you'll find that you can only go from f2.8 to f4 to f5.6 to f8, but if you've got it set to 1/3 increments, you'll get 2 extra positions between each of those full f-stops. So as I now turn the back control dial to the right, you'll notice that I'm using the 1/3 increment. So I've gone from f4 to f5 to 5.6, and then you've got the 2 intermediate settings before you reach the full f-stop. So I want to set an aperture of f6.3. It's well away from the f8 or f7.1, which gives you diffraction limited resolution, so you get slightly softer pictures. But if your aim is for just web-sized pictures or small prints, then go ahead and use f8. You probably won't notice any difference in that size of print. It's only if you're going to be shooting large format prints that you'll notice that softening with the smaller aperture. So here I've got my aperture set now to 6.3. My focus area is set to about 1/3 of the way into the picture, so I'm getting the most depth of field. So let's just take that shot and we can have a look at that in the video. So if I thought that shot was a little bit too dark, then I'll use exposure value compensation to make it lighter. So to change the control from the aperture to exposure value compensation, we use that back control dial again. So press that in and you notice exposure value compensation turns yellow, and then I can make it brighter by going to the right, which gives me positive exposure value compensation, or I can go to the left to make it darker. So in this case I want to make it just 1/3 of a stop brighter, indicated by just 1 bar on the exposure value compensation scale. So now let's take that shot and we'll see that that's just a little bit brighter. Now, as with most situations, you want to be using an ISO which is as low as possible. So use the lowest native ISO of the camera. In this case it's going to be ISO 125, so that will get the lowest noise and the best image quality. So always try and use your base ISO or native ISO when you're shooting in either aperture priority or in shutter priority mode. So the aperture will determine the amount of depth of field, and as I already stated, if you've got a very large aperture, and the largest aperture in this camera at its widest angle is f2.8, so that gives me the shallowest amount of depth of field. So you'd use that sort of aperture if you were taking portraits close up where you just want the eyes and the nose and the ears in focus, and behind that will be out of focus if you're using something like 300mm focal length, something like that. If you wanted more depth of field, then you turn this to a higher number, so all the way up to f8 if you want the maximum depth of field. So the zone of focus from your foreground to your background will be the most you can get from the camera. You get more depth of field with a wider angle than you do with telephoto. So let's have a practical example here. I'm trying to shoot this blossom here on this cherry tree. You see I'm in aperture priority mode, and because of the zoom that I've got set on the camera, I've got the maximum zoom of 400mm, so that means my smallest aperture or my widest aperture is actually f4. So that gives me an amount of depth of field which you can see on screen now, which is the blossom in focus with the background nicely out of focus. So if I just take that picture, we can have a look at that in the video. Now if we change the aperture, and again I'm going to move the back control down to the right, so we're now going to go to f8, which is the smallest aperture, which gives us the greatest depth of field. So if we take that picture now, you can probably see in the background already that the branches, which are about 10 foot behind this blossom, are starting to come into focus. So that is a little bit more visually distracting than the picture we saw with the aperture down at f4. So with a smaller aperture you get more depth of field, and with a wider aperture you get less depth of field. So that is aperture priority. Now if you look at shutter priority, and it's a case of just turning the top mode dial so the S aligns with a white index mark on the camera. So now we're looking at changing the value of the shutter speed when we use the back control dial. So as we turn to the right, you notice that the shutter speeds get faster, so the exposure gets shorter, and if I go to the left, the shutter speeds get longer, so the exposure gets longer and the image gets brighter. Remember, with photography, light is your friend and darkness is your enemy. So the more light you can get into the camera by either using a longer shutter speed or a wider aperture, the better you'll be rewarded with image quality. So for example, if you're now shooting sports, you want to be using something like the reciprocal of the focal length. So if you've got a focal length, say, of 200mm set, you want to be using a shutter speed which is about 1/200th of a second. So that will arrest the subject motion. Remember, camera image stabilization only corrects for image shake caused by movement of your hands. The actual shutter speed will determine just how much subject motion blur there is. Now you can create intentional subject motion blur by having long exposures, and those sort of situations you would create for waterfalls or silky smooth seas when you want to have that calm look against the skyline, that sort of effect. So seascapes and long exposure nightscapes, would you be using the longer shutter speeds to create that? And if necessary, you'll be using neutral density over the lens to reduce the amount of light coming into the camera so you can get those long shutter speeds. And as before, if you felt that the exposure was dark or light, you would use exposure value compensation. So again, just press in the back control dial to the right to make it brighter and to the left to make it darker. And it's as simple as that. Now, there are some situations where you may find that your aperture and shutter speed combination are flashing in red. This means for the set ISO that you've got at the moment, you'll find that the camera can't correct either the shutter speed or the aperture, depending if you're in shutter priority or aperture priority mode. At the moment we're in shutter priority mode, so this means that the aperture can't go any wider than the f3.8 that we've got at the moment, and that's because of the zoom that we've got set on the camera. So the only way we can get rid of that flashing combination is to make the shutter speed longer, so we're allowing more light into the camera, or we raise the sensitivity by raising the ISO. So let's first of all raise the ISO. So let's go to something like 1000 ISO or 1200. You press the aperture and you can now see that it's in control. So the other way was to actually increase the shutter speed. So let's go back to our ISO 200, and this time we'll change the shutter speed down to, say, a 60th, and you can see that we're under control. Well, that's it for this short video regarding the aperture and shutter priority modes. I hope you found that useful. Now, in part 4 of this series, we'll be looking at what some people call the holy grail for photography, and that is manual exposure. Now, there's nothing complex about manual exposure. You've only got 3 variables to play with: aperture, shutter speed and the ISO. And you've already seen aperture controls the depth of field, shutter speed controls your amount of subject motion blur, and the ISO you normally lock down to the lowest ISO to give you the best image quality. So really, manual exposure is down to those 2 variables again, aperture and shutter speed. You don't have exposure compensation to worry about because you'll be using either the aperture or the shutter speed to give you the brightness that you want for that particular scene. So we've taken away 1 variable for you. In my equation, I always add light as the 4th component. So instead of having an exposure triangle, I have what you call an exposure square. So light is also a component of your exposure. So it's color temperature, whether it's warm or whether it's cold, and whether it's bright and contrasty or it's dull and soft. So light can be a critical part of your components, which we'll also consider when we're shooting in the manual mode. So if you are a new viewer to the channel and you like what you see, please do click that subscribe button and the bell notification icon, and then you'll be notified when I upload new videos in this series. So as usual, thanks very much for watching. Please do take care, and of course, if you've not checked out my photographic blog, I'll put a link to that in the video description below. Check out what's there on Panasonic Lumix bridge cameras, Micro Four Thirds systems and the Canon EOS M50. So until the next video, thanks again for watching. Please do take care, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Goodbye for now.